Hi there. So I wanted to continue our discussion of Hegel's philosophy of domination, and this is kind of spelled out, as I mentioned earlier, in his massive work, The Phenomenology of Mind. And that has largely come down to us as a more general theory that has been adapted to different purposes by different academic disciplines as the theory of recognition. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that the theory of recognition was not something that was discovered. Indeed, the title of one of the more recent and more important works on Hegel by Axel Honneth, The I and We, um, puts it very succinctly. The search to decipher, to understand, to use the theory of recognition, and to elaborate on just how it is that we exist for the other is something that really does trace to antiquity. As I think I might have mentioned earlier, one can see the perplexity of the problem, the theme of the other, in early works such as the Book of Job and the Bible, and certainly in some of the great Greek tragedies. Uh, Moving forward in history, uh, one thinks also of Dostoevsky's work, The Underground Man. The Underground Man experiences the world of others, and the result of that interaction with the world of others is his um, supposed victory of it through the attitude of resentment, of spite. The underground man believes he has accomplished some victory by enacting spite on others. I'm going to show you that kind of mindset. More recent theorists, of course, Hegel is the major figure in this tradition and really brings a lot of these different strands into a context, which is true generally of his philosophy. He is a synthetic thinker of mammoth proportions, and not unlike Aristotle in that regard. So Hegel's depiction of the other was picked up by many of the 20th century's leading philosophers who took different positions on his philosophy. Probably the most famous articulation or advancement of the theory of recognition came about through the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, about whom we've spoken before. In Sartre's world, the other has the immense power over me precisely because my consciousness is dependent upon the world for its existence. I am who I am, exist for the other. Um, and I'm dependent on what it is that I'm conscious of. So that the other can negate me, and this leads famously to Sartre's final indictment of how I exist for the other. The other is hell. And uh, certainly the world we live in gives us ample opportunities to reflect on Sartre's statement about that. But I want to uh, turn to some different aspects of Hegel's philosophy of recognition and draw into account this really interesting term that's used by some of the more contemporary theorists, and that is, how is it that we encounter one another in the social world? Um, for Hegel, I encounter the world as a double. All of my moments of consciousness are to a certain extent doubled. Remember, I exist in myself and for myself, but so does the other. And um, and in order for me to encounter the other, I have to have the other to some extent uh, negate themselves as an object for me. In other words, they have to become present for me, and I have to do the same. Um, And so one could speak of this encounter, as indeed Axel Honneth does and many other theorists, as an intersubjective encounter. Must the encounter with the other be one of, of negation, be one of hell, as Sartre puts it? Well, not necessarily. Um, if you think about one's attitudes one's attitude towards the other, it doesn't exist in a vacuum either. Although many of the situations that Sartre sets up, closed room, a chance encounter in a restaurant, do have that flavor. But most of our encounters are in a social world that has a web, a context of intentions and prior moments, memories, expectations, fears, of course, but also hopes. And it also involves the world of nature. So, um, so one of the leading uh, accounts of the theory of the other that's in a more positive, takes a more positive approach, is that of contemporary ecological theorists. And if we juxtapose the perspective of ecological thinking with the encounter with the other from a Hegelian, Sartrean perspective, you see that there's some interesting things going on. How do I encounter the world, and how does that compare with how I encounter the other? Well, I could encounter the other uh, from the position of dominance, as Hegel underscores, and certainly Sartre amplifies this with his famous maxim from the Condemned of Altona: 1 + 1 = 1, voila, our mystery. And I can also carry that over into my encounter with the natural world, the will to dominate, the will to power, to use Nietzsche's vernacular. That is one way to encounter the other, to encounter the world. The philosophy of Arne Naess and other voices, Carolyn Merchant, um, in the ecological philosophy school, suggests that there's an alternative way of looking at the other, not as a separate entity, but as one who actually shares um, a place in a community that one could think of as a life world. And if we kind of shift that thinking some way and encounter the world and the other from a more holistic, from a more natural, really, perspective, then the dichotomies, the struggle that that Hegel and Sartre and many other thinkers seem to imply is always there, um, uh, does open up a horizon uh, for new possibilities. Now, having said that, one area of the philosophy of the other, or the encounter uh, with the other in the social world, that we need to touch on is um, the searing analysis and critique that was provided by the early Frankfurt School philosophers, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, um, and Theodore Adorno. For them, again, from the looking at this from the Freudian baseline of analysis, um, the group identity, the way that I exist as an I, runs into extreme difficulties when I encounter the other as a group, when I exist for others in a more general way, as a member of a group, when I have an identity with another group. Um, it's often said that the I loses its identity when it becomes a member of a group. For these later uh, thinkers, actually early Frankfurt School thinkers, that's really not entirely true. As Fromm describes it, what happens when one becomes a group, and he uses the Nazi Nazi rallies to amplify this point, is that one's kind of infantile projections come to the fore, and one finds in the group the realization of some imagined fantasies. And so one's deficits are not necessarily the problem, as Axel Honneth identifies, but uh, they become swamped in a kind of allegiance to the group. So there is that additional component to it, which, for Frankfurt School thinkers and certainly much of 20th and 21st century environmental philosophy mandates continual and deep thinking and critique. Kind of a second installment here on Hegel's philosophy of recognition. Certainly, so much more to say about this.